for the longest time, any sort of spotlight that was on African American writing, especially in a contemporary way, was always in an urban setting. And I think for the specificity of my own identity, being from Kentucky, being from rural Kentucky, being Afro-Latin, we're often invisible. And so a lot of my work pays homage to the culture that I come from. And part of that job is to make the invisible visible. My name is Crystal Wilkinson, and I'm a fiction writer, a poet, an essayist, and a cultural worker. I grew up in a little small town called Indian Creek, Kentucky, a very rural area, backwoods, actually a holler in Kentucky. And I was very influenced by my grandparents, although my grandparents only had a 3rd grade and 8th grade education. They were wonderful storytellers, wonderful craft makers. I was an avid reader as a child, and my grandmother always told the story that after I had read all the books in the house, then I started writing my own. My grandmother wrote songs and poems on the backs of envelopes on her little notebooks. She would always keep these little notepads, and I was always curious about what she was doing. She influenced me with reading, so I could read early. Like, she would read books to me, then I would mimic her reading, and then all of a sudden she discovered that I was reading. And watching her write, I began to do that too. At that time in the house, we didn't have any books that I could identify with as far as being Black, so I didn't really realize that I could be a writer. That wasn't really my early aspiration. I just knew that I loved writing and that I loved reading. And I think that my grandparents, even though they were farmers, and my grandfather was a farmer, my grandmother was a domestic worker, I think it was the room that they left me. I was always with a book and always with a sheet of paper. They encouraged me to write if that's what I wanted to do. So they were absolutely my first influences. Gail Jones. First and foremost, of course, when I found out she was from Kentucky, I was like, oh, there are writers in Kentucky. There are Black writers in Kentucky. There are Black writers who are women in Kentucky who also write about rural existence or small town existence. So, of course, Corregidora was really important to me, but so was her first short story collection, White Rat. And that was probably even more influential than Corregidora because I was able to see characters who were similar to the people that I grew up with, particularly women characters, and the ways in which she had her characters embody their own voices, the way the story set on the tongue of those women and empowered those women in those Black communities, empowered the everyday Black woman, was so important to me and gave me the agency and the freedom and permission to write my own Black womanish stories. You know, what she does is she takes both the oral and the aural and that sort of storytelling and puts you firmly in the character's body, and the character is then has their own power, their own agency, and the reader is often made uncomfortable. So when I started writing stories, my goal was to be published in a journal that I had heard of. So I finally was published in a journal that I'd heard of, and I was like, yay, okay, I'm done, that's it. It was a magazine, a Southern magazine called Now and Again, which it wasn't like one of the big ones, but I had heard of it, so that was important for me to be published in that. It's a feeling that I keep experiencing, like it's that feeling of seeing your words that you first thought of, and then wrote down, in my experience, wrote down by hand, and then you typed and you sent the manuscript out on paper, and then to have it come back to you as a work of art that's printed. There's nothing like that feeling. I mean, I just remember getting the journal back and sort of like seeing my name listed in the contents page as writers, you know, a short story by Crystal Wilkinson, and then flipping over to my page and just being elated. It's the same when I met my first agent, Marie Brown, and she said, well, do you have more of these stories? And I said, yeah, I have a whole box full of them. And so she wanted me to send them to her, and I did. And she compiled them into that first collection, which was Blackberries. And Blackberries was published. I just remember opening that first box that came and just hugging it, and just flipping through the pages and letting the air of the pages hit my face, and being in tears and screaming and crying. It's like winning everything. It's like winning the lottery. Like, I can't really explain it, but I still have it over and over. That sort of celebratory dance that I did then is still the same one that I do all these years later. Like even recently getting stories published in various journals. Water Street was my second book. I had been really influenced at that time by Gloria Naylor's Women of Brewster Place and Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio. I really set out to write a short story cycle, and wanted to use rural or small town Black characters to sort of build the world, and that's what Water Street was for me. Like, all the characters live on Water Street. Some of them know one another. To have teenage Black characters, to have young Black characters, to have the minister, to have the parents. And so that book was first published in 2002, and was my second book, and received some accolades, and I was very excited. And at that time, I think with Water Street is when I began to know that I would have a setting that I would return back to, sort of a fictional area that I sort of imagined that was in Kentucky. In Water Street, I didn't call it Opulence, but I had already decided that, like Ernest Gaines's Bayonne that he used, like Gloria Naylor's Linden Hills or Brewster Place, this would be a place that I would return to. And then I returned to it with Birds of Opulence with some of the same characters. Mona and Yolanda, two of the primary characters, also appear in Water Street. And then I go backwards in time, and in the Birds of Opulence, they're born at the beginning of the book. In Water Street, they're already adult women. In the Birds of Opulence, I go back to the 60s, and the women are born. And that book's about matriarchal lineage. That book's about the African concept of Sankofa, sort of going back to look at the past, to know where you're going in the future. And in that book, I deal with things like mental illness, and mental illness being something that is perhaps in the blood, something that you carry from the past, and you have you can't change that, something that you can't change. But then thinking of things like some dysfunction in the family that up through the generations, is this something you can change? Is this pathology something that you can change, something you want to change? So there are some things that we bring with us from the past that we can change, and some things are sort of part of ancestral memory that we can't change, that we bring forward. So those are the sort of the concepts that I wanted to look at in that book. Primarily, Birds of Opulence has so many themes, but I think one of the primary ones is mental illness or mental health among women, among Black women, and in this particular case, among rural Black women. And I really think we don't talk about it enough. We don't talk about mental health in the Black community, and I really wanted to highlight that as a part of this book. And it comes from my own experience. You know, my mother, I lived with my grandparents for a reason, and that reason was because my mother had been diagnosed as a schizophrenic when I was a child. And so I grew up sort of with that stigma of being the crazy woman's daughter. And so it's a haunt of mine. It's a theme that comes back again and again in my work, and I wanted to sort of fully explore it in The Birds of Opulence. You know, I'm the kind of writer that has a lot of ideas. You know, they come sort of like a Rolodex all the time. I'm thinking of ideas for books, ideas for stories, ideas for poems, ideas for essays. And so it's not the kind of writer that lacks ideas. The problem is which one do I choose, or which one will choose me. And so for me, something has to recur. Like I have to have an idea that, you know, comes up, moves around, goes down, comes back up. And if it comes up several times, enough to say, hello, write me, then I dive in. And it usually starts with a character. Sometimes it's an idea of a story. Then I have to see the person that's there. And then that person can't be what I call flat Sheila on a page. It can't be just, I can't just know her hairstyle or her outfit. Like I have to see her as a living, breathing human being, woman walking around in her circumstances. And once that happens, and the character takes over, then I'm just on for the ride. And I think also part of my process has to do with place. And once I came to realize that Opulence was the place that most of my characters lived in, which I think is an amalgam of the way that I grew up and sort of layered with an imaginative place that I've been living with probably since the beginning of my career. I have to see where they are in the community, what are their communal norms, what their issues are, and then I sit down and begin to write. And most of it comes with, at the beginning, comes in the form of a character sketch. You know, I teach writing, but I also, I give my students exercises, but I also give myself exercises around an idea. So a lot of it begins with play. And playing around before I get down to do the more precise work of doing scenes, of setting up a storyline, of setting up beats of action for a particular character around an idea, staging through the idea, those kinds of things, those sort of critical structural elements. Often people ask me, do you think you'll always write rural characters? And I think that I will. And I think it's, the more that I write, the more depth that has. You know, the new books that I'm working on, I'm returning to Black nature. This idea that how nature has the propensity to heal Black women. And I think we don't know that, like through slavery, through manumission, all the stages of oppression that our people have went through. Of course, we're gonna sometimes have a fear of nature because we had so many ancestors killed, hung from trees, ran through forests and woods, drowned in rivers and creeks. But I think that nature is ours, and it's time for us to reclaim that. And that's another thing that I'm trying to do with my work, to reclaim Black people's place in nature.